This was it. It was now or never. Kill or be killed yourself. The darkness in the small room was torn by flashes from my automatic rifle, bullets slamming into an officer and a soldier as they tried to stand up and find their weapons. They were screaming hoarsely and calling for help. The rumble of the assault rifle bouncing in my hands merged with their screams, and they both collapsed heavily to the floor. In one leap I crossed the room, and finding myself at the open window, began to shower the backyard with a hail of bullets. The rattle of bullets hitting the steel of my jeep proved that my aim was correct, and they could not raise their heads. The beams of the torches flickered haphazardly in different directions, and the sergeant ordered them extinguished in desperation. Suddenly everything went dark, and I could only see the flash of carbine shots, hear the whistle of bullets flying through the window, and the sound of them hitting the walls. The magazine of my automatic was empty. The muffled clanking of its mechanism as I pulled the trigger reminded me that the magazine pouches were on the floor next to the bed. Sprawling on the floor, I wriggled my way over to it and searched for the magazine pouches, listening to the singing of bullets a few centimeters above my head. Soon I found what I was desperately looking for. Pulling the magazine from the pouch and inserting it into the rifle instead of the empty one was a matter of seconds, but they seemed like half a year to me. Touching the belt with the holsters around my neck, I was ready for further action. The movement, heard rather than seen by eye, fell silent after a short burst of machine gun fire. I reckoned that a second burst, sent through the window, would keep the policeman in place for a while. In 2 leaps, I reached the door and found myself in a narrow passage. A figure flashed at the end of it, but collapsed to the floor, struck down by my cue. I was conscious that this firing, which would last 1 or 2 minutes, would bring the whole garrison of the village to its feet. I had only one reasonable option left to me, and that was to run, and run as fast and as far away as possible. I had a chance to hide in the desert under cover of darkness. As I passed through the corridor, I leaped out of the door and, fiercely pulling the trigger of my automatic, began to fire bullets left and right, as if I were holding a garden hose instead of a gun. That's how I crossed the road. The bullets squealed past, and I realized that several policemen had gone round the backyard and out to the front of the Guzzi house, firing at me indiscriminately. Reaching the houses on the other side of the street, I ducked through the nearest open door. My attempt to fire another line was futile. The shop was empty again. Ahead of me I could hear screams of terror. Behind me from the street I could hear police shouts and rifle shots. As I was inserting a new magazine, a car with brightly burning headlights came into the street. At the same second, in the light of those headlights, I saw 2 soldiers crossing the street in my direction. I gave a short burst and they stopped. I didn't see if I hit them or if they just lay down, but I didn't. Running through the house, I made my way into the kitchen, where a lamp was burning. Next to the hearth, leaning against the wall, stood an old woman. When she saw me, she gave a scream of horror and fear. I sprang out of the back door and crossed the backyard, but I was not sure where to go next, for it was pitch black all around. I could only see the dim silhouettes of other houses, and I tried to get as far away from the house I'd just left as quickly as possible. Something hit me in the throat, knocking me out of breath, but as I stretched out on the ground I realized I had hit a clothesline stretched between 2 poles. Not far behind me the firing continued. The soldiers were still shelling the front door of the house I had entered. I hoped the old woman would not be hurt. The noise of engines now came from everywhere and the excited shouts had increased. Rising to my feet, I left the place as quickly as possible. I had to hide for a while where there were no soldiers and no lights. My boots clattered on the rocks and crunched on the coarse sand. These sounds could give away my location. Stopping in the shade of a tree, I listened for movement from the pursuers, but heard nothing but excited voices and the staccato of machine gun bursts and rifle shots. So the policemen were still shelling that house. Apparently they hadn't noticed me jumping out of the back door, but they would soon realize that I had managed to elude them. The light of the car headlights was fast approaching the place where the shooting was going on. Soon they would see that the bird had flown away. I was only a few hundred meters away, but I had no idea where to turn or in which direction to run. Taking off my shoes so that my footsteps would not be so audible, I tried to visualize where Guzzy's Inn was and from which side I had entered the village. I could not think straight in my condition, but I remembered the arrangement of the houses in the village square. An idea flashed in my mind, and I kept moving in the hope of getting out of this hornet's nest. Suddenly the firing stopped and there was silence. I thought that my footsteps, even without boots, could be heard for several kilometers. It was not easy to move on the ground of El Yuba, which was strewn with sharp stones. After the shooting stopped, the excited shouts came again and became even louder. Probably my pursuers had entered that house and found no one but the old woman in the kitchen. Though she was faint, she had no need to explain to them that I had escaped through the back door from the kitchen. At the end of me, I saw a low mud hut, kept away from it, went round to the left and left it behind me. Suddenly there was the light of a headlamp just ahead of me. There must have been another street here. 2 more cars emerged from around the corner, no more than 200 meters from me, and were heading in my direction. Searching for cover, I spotted several dark hillocks that looked like rocky ledges. After making a few runs, I reached these knolls, which turned out to be petrol barrels. I hid behind them. 20 seconds later, the beams of the headlights illuminated the barrels, and my palms were covered with cold sweat. The beams flickered 3 times, then the cars drove off. I didn't dare move for fear that there might be other cars nearby. If I left my hiding place, I would be out in the open. The trucks stopped no more than 300 meters from my hiding place. There were commands given in a harsh tone of voice, and soldiers spilled out of the vehicles. The vehicles took up positions so that their headlights illuminated the area and the walls of the house I had left. I saw other soldiers pressed against the walls of the house with rifles at the ready. At least 25 men had arrived on the lorries. They lined up in a line and began moving towards the house, surveying the area. If they come in from all 4 sides, I'll be in the sack and 1 machine gun won't save me. Watching the soldiers trotting in the headlights of their vehicles, I slipped out from behind the barrels and crawled away from them. Soon I came upon a ditch, beyond which was a road of some kind, but I could see no houses nearby. I could hear my heart pounding loudly in my chest. Clutching my gun in one hand and my boots in the other, I sprinted across the road. Looking back, I saw that the soldiers had almost reached the house, but there was now about half a kilometer between us. There were stone ledges sticking out all around me, sliding behind a rock. I tried to calm down and assess the situation. It was useless to move blindly in any direction. I could run into a sentry guarding the camp or warehouse, and 1 shot would be enough to bring the whole garrison to its feet. I felt a great pain in my feet and realized that I had cut them on sharp stones, but it seemed a trifle trifling now. Then suddenly I saw the monument at the top of the hill. It stood out clearly against the starry sky and was something like a road sign to me. It immediately gave me my location. At that moment, a shot rang out near the house the soldiers were searching. Whether it was an accident or a false alarm, the barrage of fire that followed would have done honor to the defenders of Tobruk. It amused me slightly, but I knew immediately that it gave me a chance to keep going. One thing was certain: as long as gunfire could be heard coming from the town, then I wasn't the one being shot at. I came across a few more buildings, but I avoided them and continued on my way. Then something swift came towards me, and I heard a clatter of gravel, and I threw myself on the ground, trying to get it in my sights, but before I could do so, it was on me. I almost started to shoot, but realized in time that it was a mongrel dog that had heard my footsteps. It raised a terrible bark, but I grabbed a stone and threw it at the fleeing animal. With a thud, the stone reached its target, and instead of barking, I heard a pitiful shriek. A man's voice came from the house I had passed, and from the guttural sounds I knew it was an Arab. The dog, still whimpering in pain, ran towards the voice. I ran away just in case it occurred to the Arab to see what it was that had frightened his dog. I was now some distance from the streets and roads. I could see many lit headlights in the distance, but not a single car was moving in my direction. The lights were on in almost all the houses. The shooting had stopped. I wondered, they must have shot some poor bastard who had jumped out of his girlfriend's room and ended up riddled with bullets. The pain in my feet was terrible. The soles hurt to touch, but I didn't dare put on my shoes. The squeak of my shoes could be heard far into the night, and I decided that it was better to walk through the pain than to be shot by some sentry. In half an hour I was well away from the village. Tired and broken, I sat down on the ground. I was on top of one of the rocky hills surrounding El Yuba. The thorny bushes provided good cover, but it was not easy to wade through them. Their stiff and prickly branches scratched and tore at their skin. It was the soles of my feet that gave me the most trouble. I rubbed them with my fingers to get rid of the grit embedded in the many small cuts. I checked the contents of my pockets and found a rolled-up bundle of 100 lire notes. I would have gladly given them for a couple of clean handkerchiefs to bandage my feet, but I had left my trousers at the house of the old bugger Guzzy, and the dirty handkerchiefs had gone to the wash. I had no others. So the thin cotton socks issued to Wehrmacht soldiers had turned to rags. Besides, they were hardly wearable at all. In Germany they were apparently made of cellulose, and when soaked with sweat they became as stiff as boards. No handkerchief, no bandages, no socks, moreover not a sip of water, and the first attacks of thirst were already tormenting me. At that moment I realized that, although I had managed to leave El Yuba, my situation had not improved much. I had simply come to the point of having to make a decision to die, to surrender, or to do something unpredictable. What that act might be, I could not imagine. The fatigue of a hard escape overcame me. The tension of the last few hours was taking its toll, and I decided to take a little rest, feeling some temporary safety. But I realized that I would not be able to rest properly here. I had to find somewhere more private. The lights of El Yuba glowed in the distance, so peaceful and inviting, but not. The fate that awaits a deserter is a fate I would not wish on anyone, I thought. Life is a nightmare. You get shot at here, you get shot at there, and nowhere feels safe. I realized I'd reached a point of no return. Perhaps I had reached it long ago, but I only realized it now. I was in the depths of the desert with no food, no water, no transport, no belongings, and only a very faint hope of getting where I wanted to go, with only one friend, an automatic rifle with so little ammunition left. The short stay at the top of the hill did me no good. My feet had swollen badly in the meantime, and when I rose to my feet a dull pain spread through them. Still, I decided not to put on my boots. Their creaking on the pebbles might attract my pursuers in the darkness, so I limped on, silent and cautious, through the pain. The tops of the rocky hills were covered with gravel, but at the bottom there were patches of sand that were easier to walk on barefoot. Still, it was safer at the top than at the bottom of the hills. When the day came, I would be seen at once at the bottom, and at the top I myself would see any movement. Moving very slowly, and each time choosing where to step, I finally realized that I would have to rest while I could. The tension of the previous night had taken a heavy toll on me. I found a large rock with a fairly flat top. Climbing onto it, I laid down, putting my boots under my head instead of a pillow. I knew that the dew would soon fall and soak everything, and that it would get very cold between 2 and 4 in the morning. The cold would pervade me until the sun rose from behind the horizon. Looking up at the starry sky, I felt insignificant and felt that all of humanity had turned against me. The rock on which I was resting exuded a warmth that chased away my longing and loneliness like a sleeping pill, and I fell soundly asleep. But the chill of the night first made me toss and turn in a half-sleep, and then completely engulfed me. When I got up, I realized that I had slept only a little and would not fall asleep until the sun came up from behind the horizon. The greying sky meant that a new day would soon arrive. Looking down at El Yuba, I could see that part of the village was already awake. Every now and then I could hear the roar of engines starting up as some driver was checking his engine at the crack of dawn and revving it up. Here and there were distant and faint glimmers of light. As I stretched my aching legs, I was aware that at first light, the patrols would probably scour the village and neighborhood in search of me, for there must have been wounded and killed in yesterday's mess. My guess is that the captain and the soldiers holding me at gunpoint were killed or wounded, most likely killed. A burst from an MP-38 rifle at close range leaves little chance of survivors, and when I fired, the distance was very short, and they must have been hit by several 9mm caliber bullets each. As I looked in the direction opposite El Uba, I noticed a small fire burning no more than half a kilometre away. Some Arab had spent the night there and was now tossing withering embers into last night's fire to revive it. Arabs do not leave a large fire overnight. Fuel supplies are scarce, and even further out in the desert, where there are not even bushes, dried camel dung is used to keep up a smouldering semblance of a fire. I had to take into account not only military patrols but also wandering Arabs, especially those travelling on horseback and not alone, and their mongrel dogs would be a particularly unpleasant nuisance to me. The pain in my legs subsided a little. I tried to get to my feet, but they were pierced by an infernal pain. My feet were visibly swollen. As I climbed down from the large rock on which I had been sleeping, the pain of their contact with the uneven ground would have satisfied any masochist or Indian fakir. Heavy drops of dew hung from all the branches and thorns of the bushes around me, and this seemed to be my only chance to get drunk today. When I took off my shirt, I was glad it was clean, for I had only put it on last night. My old one was so soaked with sweat and dirt that I would have thrown up. Spreading the shirt on the ground under a bush, I shook it vigorously, and soon many drops formed small puddles on the fabric. Then, carefully lifting the edges of the cloth, I gathered the water into one small puddle and sucked it right out of there. Repeating this procedure a few times, I soon quenched my thirst and also had a damp shirt, which was just in time to wipe the multiple cuts on my feet. I wrapped the wet shirt around my feet, hoping it would reduce the swelling while I waited for dawn. By then I should be on my way. But where to, on what, and with what? Leaning back, I began to search for answers to these questions. My jeep was lost, along with all its cargo, including maps, which are essential in the desert, and a small compass, without which it is impossible to turn off the roads without danger of getting lost. What important conditions for my survival were water, then food, and finally transport. I knew you couldn't get far in the desert on foot, especially if you were being hunted and hounded like a hound hunt. But the soldiers were the hounds. I had to admit that my original plan to get to Portuguese West Africa had to be abandoned. I can't get there, at least not now. Too many essentials have been lost. It's not hard to list everything I have. One shirt, a pair of trousers, a pair of army boots, 3 full magazines of ammunition, 96 in all A, and 1 incomplete magazine in the machine gun itself, and the machine gun itself, the only guarantee of my safety, and a roll of 100 lire notes which were useless as far as their purchasing power was concerned. I had nowhere and nothing to buy. A gun, of course, might have solved my problems. With it I could get another car, even more so. Unless, of course, I missed the chance that the gun would provide. The first rays of the sun peeked out from behind the distant hills. Along with its warmth came the roar of an engine, not unlike a car engine, for it rumbled faster and louder, which came from over the crest of the hill. At the last second, before the aeroplane appeared overhead, I managed to press myself against the rock. The trainer plane was circling above me, and as it flew over the top of the hill, the wings wiggled. It was the pilot maneuvering, trying to get a better look at the terrain below him. It passed me and flew flush with the ridge for a while, then glided along the slope towards El Uba. Then he flew over the village and began the same maneuver over the hills on the other side. I was conscious that he was looking for me, but realized that he had no idea in which direction I had fled. Apparently, I had done the Italians a lot of damage last night since they had decided to look for me from the aeroplane. Now I was sure that all roads leading in and out of the village would be blocked, patrols raised on alert, and observers scanning the hillsides with binoculars. The Italians were great experts when it came to catching one man. Things would have looked very different if a significant number of enemy soldiers were involved. In that case, the zeal of the Italians would have been nil, or at least greatly reduced. Now I had already had to get my feet into my boots, however swollen they might be. After several attempts, this seemed impossible. Finally, with the sharp end of a stone, I made incisions in the leather of my boots, slipped my feet into them with effort, and walked slowly and painfully. After 3 hours of very cautious advance, I reached the spot more than 3.5 kilometers from the guardhouse where the sentry had stopped me yesterday. Assuming that the Italians knew that I had come from the Barkshu side and had entered El Uba from that side, I decided that they would patrol the opposite exit from El Uba towards Dernay, expecting me to continue in the same direction. I don't think they would be able to assume that a fugitive would venture to take the old route back the other way. I was now taking shelter by the side of that road, where I had that day traversed a steep rise before turning nearly 180 degrees. The speed of traffic, especially for lorries, on this stretch would not exceed that of a pedestrian. I was now in a place from which I could see the road below, El Uba in the distance, and in the other direction, almost as far away, the cistern at Sidi Bou Halfaya. The patrols on the hill could not detect me, for I was hidden under a ledge of rock. Moreover, any patrol passing above me would have given away their presence by the fall of small stones. My feet felt almost no pain, though they continued to swell. I had a suspicion that they were beginning to go numb. Still, I did not dare to take off my boots, doubting that I would be able to put them back on. My 3-hour walk to this place had made me very thirsty, and the prospect of no water did not diminish my desire for the precious liquid. Swarms of sticky flies landed and crawled on the exposed parts of my skin, but the total lack of sweat and dry skin gave these buzzing flies little to eat. If I had plenty of water and moist skin, they would have driven me crazy. The lack of drinking water in that sense was, if not a comfort, at least a slight advantage. It was a long time, maybe 2 hours, before some movement was heard in the distance, on the motorway. Something big was moving there, kicking up clouds of yellow dust. A quarter of an hour later, a German convoy of 14 lorries, moving in tight formation, passed me on the road below and left swirls of dense, dry dust in the air. With envy, I looked at the jerry cans reinforced on the doors. I would gladly shoot someone for a canful of clear bubbling liquid. An hour later, a few more lorries headed in the direction of El Uba, but messing with the convoy was out of the question. Next was a messenger on a motorbike from the direction of El Uba. I felt the urge to shoot him just to take away his flask of water and his motorbike. Then I could move faster and wait for more suitable prey. But I knew I wouldn't do that, even if it was the easiest thing in the world. If he fired first, I wouldn't hesitate to put a few bullets in him. I had little chivalry left in me and even less desire for fair play. The desert, the lack of water, and my present situation left me no such luxury as fair play. I would have committed murder for that matter, though I would not have considered it murder, but I was disgusted at the thought of killing a messenger. For a long time there was no sign of life on either side of the track. The sun was already high. I pressed myself even tighter against the wall under the overhanging rock. It would be hard to move under the sun with my head uncovered. I was increasingly thirsty, and I looked eagerly for a cloud of dust above the shuddering waves of heated air on the horizon. I was beginning to wish I'd shot the motorcyclist. At least I would have been able to get a flask of water. I even had the thought of returning to the guardhouse where I had stopped yesterday to chat with the Italian sentry. An unexpected move might have brought success even without shooting, if I had got the chap to whom I had given 100 lire. But with my head uncovered in the sun, my feet shattered, swollen and almost numb, I could hardly waddle more than 3 kilometers to that guardhouse, and I had to do it stealthily. Besides, if something went wrong and I had to shoot, the alarm would be sounded immediately, and I would not be able to get away. The thought of that sentry's flask tormented me like a mirage, tantalizing and inaccessible. I knew I had no chance of getting water unless some sort of transport appeared where I was now. Nor would I be able to leave this place and the whole damn neighborhood except on wheels. So the logical thing to do was to get hold of a lorry or a motorbike without delay. I felt that if I didn't get a drink of water in the next hour, I might lose my mind and my ability to reason from thirst, and that meant that the game was over. In the distance, a swirl of dust could be clearly seen against the clear sky. As it rose over the desert, its grotesque shape revived in me the hope of getting water. What would it bring me, life or death, I wondered, as I watched it wriggle slowly towards me along the road. It wasn't a convoy. It was a lone lorry. The dust from a convoy would have stood in a long wall, and this was a pencil-thin cloud. This was my chance to get water or a bullet, and I would take my chance. Glancing anxiously in the direction of El Uba, I was relieved to see that nothing was moving from there. It would be most inconvenient if two lorries converged on my point of operational action. One would suffice, perhaps even more than enough. I took the automatic and replaced the half-empty magazine with a full one. I now had 32 rounds, and that should be enough. With a sharp sound, the bolt drove the first round into the chamber. I intended to grab the approaching truck at the 180-degree turn, reverse it, and try to get as far away from El Uba as possible. I'd already studied the section of the bend and concluded that it allowed me to turn the truck around without getting its wheels stuck in the deep, loose sand or rolling down the slope. The ground at the side of the road was firm, though uneven. It would not be difficult for an experienced driver to turn round there. So a question remained, however, whether the truck was Italian or German, and whether there was a second driver in the cab. What was this lorry carrying? Supplies or soldiers? If it was a soldier, I was dead. However, the same end awaits me if I don't get water soon. As the vehicle approached, I could clearly make out that it was a lorry, but that was all I could make out behind a veil of dust, some of which was driven forward by the crosswind. A last glance in the direction of El Uba convinced me that nothing was moving from there. I slowly made my way down the steep slope for about 7 meters. I heard the driver shift the engine to a lower gear and the truck began a steep climb. There would soon be a sharp turn, and the truck's speed would be no more than that of a pedestrian. I waited, braced against the rock. I realized there was no point in opening fire immediately. The drivers must have been alerted to the fact that I was lurking somewhere nearby and might not stop, or return fire, or prepare to shoot. The tearing sounds of the engine were heard closer and closer. Looking out from behind the cliff, I saw first the clouds of dust at the bend in the road, and then a German Opel lorry. My heart jumped with joy when I saw only one man in the driver's cab. I was ready to act. Then, seeing that the rest of the lorry was covered by a tarpaulin, I stayed in my hiding place until it drove past, showering me with puffs of dust. I peered into the back of the truck, saw that the soldiers weren't there, tore forward along the shaky side and jumped onto the running board. The blued snout of my assault rifle slid through the open window. Death grinned in the driver's face. The man behind the wheel was so petrified of surprise that the truck almost went off the track. I shouted for him to stop, bringing him back to reality. The truck came to a jerking halt. "Put your hands up," I ordered, "and keep them where I can see them." The driver opened his mouth to reply, but my appearance must have rendered him speechless. I took a seat beside him and put the barrel in his ribs, and with my hand I searched his belt for a weapon, but found nothing. There was nowhere to look. The driver was wearing only shorts and a shirt. "Where's your gun?" I shouted to him, happy to see a successful outcome. He nodded at the pocket in the door. Without taking my eyes off the driver, I pulled out a parabellum and slipped it behind my belt. "All right, let's go. Turn the truck around," I ordered him. He didn't argue, because the barrel of my automatic was in his ribs. As he turned around, I looked for his flask and soon found it hanging under the dashboard. I picked it up and unscrewed the cap. The driver, busy turning the truck around, couldn't do anything extra. The lukewarm tea in the flask tasted better than any nectar. "How far do you want me to take you?" he asked, and I caught his fleeting glance. "Look, what's your name?" I asked and pulled the barrel away from him. "Thanks, it hurt like hell when that thing hit my ribs," he said. "My name is Host, Supply Company, 15th Armored Division. Only a few months ago our units were neighbors at the airfield in El Adama." I guess I didn't need to introduce myself. It was as if he read my mind and asked, "Is your last name Bainan?" I took another sip of tea from my flask before answering. "How do you know that I am Bannerman?" I asked. "By the way, do you have much more water?" I was concerned that the contents of the flask were rapidly diminishing. "No, 3 jerry cans," he replied. I was lucky. I now had not only a truck, but also a sea of water. "And the food?" I asked. "Enough to feed a whole company for 4 days," he assured me, skillfully avoiding the potholes. Petrol?" "A full barrel, besides what's in the tank," he replied. I chuckled aloud. I'd won, hadn't I? Now I'll be rid of all my worries and troubles. "Nothing will happen to you," I assured him, "unless you do something stupid. I'll take your lorry and its contents and I'll let you go. You can use this road to get to El Ubba or back to Marowar, wherever you want." "Look, I'm not going to do anything stupid," Horst said. "We were warned this morning in Marowar that we might meet you. We were also told what happened in El Uba and how you treated the Italians there. I don't want any part of it. The lorry and the cargo aren't worth it. I won't stop you if you want to leave, so take everything but leave me alone. I'll stay out of your way, whatever you're up to." As we drove along, I considered his words for a while. He seemed grateful to me, too grateful, but when I thought about it, I realized that he had no other choice. His gun was taken away, a machine gun was shoved under his ribs. He had no choice but to obey. There was no point in him resisting, especially after what he had been told in Marowar about last night's massacre in El Uba. "Well, in that case, I think I'll have another sip," I said good-naturedly, and tipped the flask upward and squeezed the last drop into my parched gut. "Do you know where this motorway turns off to the Machuba bypass?" I asked and hung the empty flask under the dashboard. Torst grinned. "I passed that corner no more than an hour before you told me to turn the lorry round." He kept his eyes on the rutted road ahead of us. The speedometer was reading about 50 kilometers an hour, which wasn't bad for a road like this. "There's a tanker called Sidibu Carfire," I told him. "There I'll drop you off and you can vote when some car comes along." "How far would you be able to drive this lorry?" he asked, with a sidelong glance at me. I didn't answer immediately, thinking to myself, but really, how far will I go? Soon we reached a tanker, which was not far from the road. Reducing our speed, we drove over uneven terrain and drove behind some rocks. "If there's anyone here," I told him, "act like I'm your replacement, in which case we'll get out of here." He nodded, looking at the rocks around us. We pulled up to the cistern. There was no one in sight. The 3 Arabs I had seen here yesterday had dismounted and left. Forst was looking around carefully, probably hoping someone would turn up and free him. I realized that he would be in trouble when he turned up at his unit without a car or provisions. "Now get out," I ordered and watched as he opened the door. Standing on the ground, he turned to me. "You're not going to leave me here without water, are you?" he asked anxiously, looking at the empty flask hanging from the dashboard. I laughed heartily and climbed out of the cabin. "No, though you can't die of thirst in such a short time. I'd been without water for 3/4 of a day before I got your flask, so don't worry. The first passing convoy will pick you up in a couple of hours." Forst said nothing to this, but went back to the rock and sat down. "You better boil some water for coffee while I see what you've got in the lorry," I suggested. "So you're not leaving now?" he asked. "Not until tonight," I said, and hung the machine gun on my shoulder. "Shit, there won't be any convoys or cars on the road at night." He started to complain. "So what?" I cut him off. "You'll wait till tomorrow, then someone will pick you up." He silently got up and took his duffel bag out of the driver's cab. A kettle half filled with sand, well soaked in petrol, took the place of the primus, and I examined the load, glancing, however, at Horst. He boiled water and made coffee. I did not want to take any chances. I couldn't tell whether the reason for his behavior was fear, or whether he was planning something, hoping to catch me when I let my guard down. Horst didn't try to talk to me, just did as he was told, carefully and unhurriedly. The cargo included the usual tinned food: stew, tuna in oil, a few iron rations, they were always of good quality, and other provisions, and in addition a barrel of petrol and 3 jerry cans of water. There was nothing else I could use. Tell touted that the coffee was ready. In silence, we each ate a can of stew with 2 slices of German black bread. This kind of black bread, baked in Africa, was the most delicious bread I had ever eaten in my life. Among the crap we were fed, there was nothing better than this bread. At last Horst looked up and broke the silence. "What made you desert?" he asked, and I could read curiosity in his gaze. "It's too long a story, Horst," I answered. "Besides, you wouldn't understand." Perhaps. It is indeed very difficult to understand why a Knight of the Iron Cross First Class chose this path," he commented quietly. I glanced at him quickly. "Do you think it would take a coward to desert, and the very last one at that?" "Well, that's the way it usually happens. What other reason could there be? Except in your case, considering your honours. You must have had something else," he muttered, pouring coffee into his mug. "Have you ever wondered what Scaria? To keep fighting the enemy, or to be hunted like game by the German army, the police and the Italians, with the aim of putting you up against the wall and spanking you?" I asked him. He thought for a moment before answering. "Yes, I suppose it's harder to be game. No friends, no peace, no place to hide," he said thoughtfully. "What we couldn't understand when we heard the reports of your escape," Tedis went on, "was why you and that other fellow didn't cross the front line and surrender to the British at Tobruk or at Es Salam." He looked up at me quickly. "Tell me, where is the other guy who went with you?" The question about Joseph took me by surprise. It was not that I had forgotten Joseph, but he had not occupied my thoughts for a long time, for my life was so feverish and dangerous that I had to think only of how to save myself. "We have heard rumours of your adventures, but nothing of your comrade," Horst explained. "What can we hear about him if he is dead?" I answered him. "All stories usually end after the funeral." Horst looked at me for a while I sipped my coffee. "When you get back to your unit, Horst, tell your company commander that, private or if you like. I don't think Joseph would mind. Deserter Hinz was killed in a hurricane raid on Via Balbia. I suppose the court-martial will be relieved to know that Hinz's life ended in the Libyan sands." I remarked cynically. "And where is his body?" Horst asked. I almost jumped up. "Do you think I left Joseph to be mauled by predators or field gendarmes?" I shouted at him. "That's not what I meant. I just wanted to ask if anyone knew where he was buried." I shook my head. Before my eyes I saw the low ridge of the Marmariki overlooking the Mediterranean Sea below El Ghazala, the crack in the rock, the hole under the big rock where Joseph was buried, and the pile of small stones with which I had covered my friend's grave so that no one would ever find him. "Let's not talk about it," I said, and rose to my feet. In 2 hours the day would be over, and I would be on my way. We filled the tank of the truck with petrol from a steel barrel. I gave Horst the water flask and all his personal belongings. I didn't need them. On a piece of paper I wrote a few lines about Joseph's death for the commander of the company in which Horst served, hoping that Joseph's relatives would receive news of his death. I wondered if his parents had already been informed that he had deserted. Night descended quickly. I had to go. The journey was not a long one. Since there would be no cars after dark, Horst chose a place to sleep. He had food, water, a duffel bag, and 1 blanket. The other I kept for myself. As we parted, I held out my hand to him. He pretended not to notice. I didn't pay any attention to it, just turned round, got into the cab and drove off, leaving him by the roadside with everything he needed. He didn't have much to worry about, but I had something to worry about. The Opel I had captured was a clumsy, rumbling lorry, not really suited for travelling in the desert. I realized this very quickly as I drove from Sidi Boukal-Faya to the Martuba bypass. I drove it at a speed of 50 kilometers an hour without turning on the headlights. Sometimes I found a smoother road, and sometimes I had to follow the ruts made by other cars. The Opel was much less suitable for desert driving than the English Jeep I had lost. On bumpy roads it bounced terribly. It was rear-wheel drive only, and that had an immediate effect on the sandy sections. The Bedford was a four-wheel drive car, and its suspension and larger tyres provided some comfort, at least far superior to the Opel's. I soon reached the Matuba track and was relieved that the road was better. In about an hour I passed the tombs and graves where the ashes of the ancient Arab sheikhs rest. The poor off-road capability of the Opel made me realize that the loss of the Jeep, its cargo and my personal belongings would require me to change my plans. Without navigational aids, compass, maps, and other aids, my original plan to cross the desert to Lake Chad would have to be abandoned. The Opel won't survive the real desert. It would almost certainly get stuck in the sand, and in areas swarming with German and Italian patrols, it would mean certain death for me. To avoid encountering patrols, I would have to go deep into the desert. When I reached the turnoff for Fort Harlan, I stopped the truck, not knowing what to do or where to go next. There was only a single paved road to the fort, which was perched on top of a mountain. I knew there was an Italian garrison there. It would be unwise to go there after my exploits at El Uba. Obviously, I would no longer be able to convince the sentries that I was a German soldier on official duty, and tomorrow it would be known that I was driving a stolen Opel, with insufficient supplies with an unsuitable vehicle, which could not be replaced by any other either by force or cunning. Since all German and Italian units in Cyrenaica were now on full alert, I had to devise a new plan. There were two ways of proceeding. One was to move to the nearest enemy position on the front line near Tobruk beyond Akroma and try to surrender to the British. But that was easier said than done. I would have to pass through German and Italian positions, risk my life to get through our minefields, then through the minefields of besieged Tobruk, British wire fences, and overcome a host of other obstacles. If I didn't get shot by the Germans or Italians or stumble on one of their patrols, there remained a very likely chance of being riddled with bullets from an Australian Bren machine gun or something else. The other plan was to get to Egypt and surrender to the British there. I got into the Opel again and, with my head full of unsolvable problems, headed towards Matuba. I reached Matuba before sunset and drove around the town at high speed about 2 kilometers away, hoping that no one had heard the noise of my truck's engine or seen it. Matuba had a fairly strong German and Italian garrison, a base depot for Italian convoys, and a mobile brothel where Hoys led a luxurious life of desert queens. According to my information, it took more than 1 3-ton lorry to transport to the Carina Bank the money that the prostitutes earned here by serving several thousand soldiers. There, this money was divided among themselves by high-ranking rear chiefs, who lived a life far from the front, raising a glass to the victories of their comrades dying under enemy fire. When dawn broke, I had already travelled far into the desert. It was time for me to think about where to spend the day. I had passed the low mountains of El Akdar, and now I was surrounded by a true desert, where the space stretching to the horizon was covered with bizarre sand waves that changed their shape with each sandstorm that swept over the hot, loose surface. There were no cliffs, no dry beds, not a single shady spot in this region. I realized it was useless to stop here, as I would simply roast in the sun during the day. Even though my lorry was kicking up huge clouds of dust, I had to risk being seen, but I had to keep going. For hours I stared into the shivering waves of heat that fringed the horizon. I kept waiting to see if a similar dust cloud would appear nearby, but I was alone with the desert. It's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, climbing up a sandy hill. I saw the old deserted fort of Bir Hakeim in front of me. A few dozen kilometers from here was the airfield at El Adam. I was now not far from where I had started my escape with Joseph. I climbed the sandy hill, unaware that Bir Hakeim was so close, and realized that the roar of the engine and the huge columns of dust raised by my car could be seen there. It was useless to approach furtively now that I had fully exposed myself. The condition of the mud brick walls of the fort spoke of abandonment. As I slowly approached its brownish-yellow fortifications, resembling those of a medieval castle. I could see no movement or any other sign of life. The open doorway of the entrance, which once had massive double wooden doors, stared ominously at me. Outside, by the crumbling walls, the rusted hulks of cars protruded. The road leading to the entrance and its sand-covered archway had been clear of car tracks since the last sandstorm that had covered everything in sand. Pressing the accelerator pedal, which made the engine roar, I sped toward the archway and drove under it, entering the sun-drenched square of the fortress courtyard. Stopping the car in the center, I picked up my automatic rifle and looked around, expecting an attack. There was none. The silence, intensified by the oppressive heat, had a depressing effect on me. I slowly surveyed the platform that stretched along the wall, 1.5 meters below the crumbling loopholes. There was no movement, only ruin and ruin. At one end of the square were the barracks that housed the fort's commanders. They were built against the wall and topped with loopholes that ran along the roofs of these buildings. Dark openings of windows without frames or panes stared at me like the eyes of dead men. The doorways were like Mercep's traps waiting for someone to enter. Complete desolation reigned everywhere. Not a sound, not a whisper, nothing that my strained hearing could pick up. There were no fresh footprints in the square, only the parts of broken guns and the broken spokes of the wheel of an old Italian field gun, which stuck up into the sky like pointing fingers. The place was frightening in its silence, which portended trouble or something unpredictable. Keeping my eyes on the empty doorways and windows, I climbed out of the cabin with my automatic rifle. I approached the barracks and looked inside one of the rooms. Before my eyes was an empty space. There was not even a chair or a table. The floor was littered with empty cigarette packs, and rusty stew tins were lying here and there. I walked from room to room, and when I reached the huge dining room, a large lizard slipped past me and disappeared into a hole at the base of a rotten wall. Looking at this frightening desolation, I realized that Bir Hakeim had been abandoned for quite some time. The shadows from the fort walls lengthened. It will be sunset soon. It would be more prudent to spend the night here rather than in the desert, I decided. I quickly returned to the truck, started the engine, and drove up to the wall next to the archway, pointing the car outward in case I had to leave immediately. There was an hour of daylight time left, just enough to eat dinner. I glanced up at the steps leading up to the loopholes, 7 meters above me. I slung my assault rifle belt over my shoulder and started to climb up the ladder. The wood of the steps had already begun to rot. Looking out over the thick mud wall, I saw the desert in front of me. It was hard to decide which was more lonely, this fort or the sandy expanse that stretched to the horizon. In the fort walls stretched old rusty wire fences, partly covered with sand. Here and there the remains of motor cars awaited their complete destruction. Among the sparse thorn bushes that crowned the sand dunes, petrol barrels and jerry cans were also waiting to be buried. In the central entrance, there was a still visible chain of footprints of my car, the only stamp on the empty space. The sun, losing its heat, hung over the horizon like an open firebox. Soon it would dive down. Somewhere not far to the east was the Libyan-Egyptian border, a clear line made up of barbed wire fences that stretched from Al Saloum to the oasis of Al Jagbub Barabout. I climbed down from the wall, built a small fire in a tin of petrol-soaked sand, and started cooking a meal of tinned horror stew seasoned with onions. These onions worked wonders. They made the mess edible. Coffee after dinner was a real treat as the shadows from the fort walls lengthened and slowly faded into night. Then the black, silver gleaming sky and the stars covered Bir Hakeim like a shroud. I lay on the blanket for a long time with my head on the back wheel and mentally made the journey that lay ahead of me tomorrow. There would be the undulating desert again, and then barbed wire fences. If I crossed them, Libya would be left behind, but whether my misfortunes would remain there, I could not say. Somewhere along the barbed wire there would be an opening through which I could get through. There was a place called Fort Madalena, and further south was Bayer Sheferzen. There might be gaps in the wire fences at both places. Then I'll be in Egypt. How am I supposed to live there? The fort was quiet, the desert immovable, the stars seemed to be fading. I fell asleep. Did my eyes open, or was it a dream? The moon couldn't be that bright. I realized that a torch was shining into my eyes, and the blue glow in its beam came from a Thompson submachine gun. Its barrel, though small, was as big as a drainpipe at my face. My sleep-fog brain, quickly awakening, told me that the bright light and the barrel staring mockingly at me were not a dream. I couldn't brush the obsession away with my hand. I felt pain and saw a shoe shod on my wrist, pinning me to the ground. Now I was fully awake. I had been caught. The thought filled my whole being with terror. I tried through the light of the lantern to see the men who had decided my fate. This is the firing squad, the end of the road, the end of a long, long journey. I wished the machine gun looking at me would open fire right now. A Thompson submachine gun? My brain suddenly latched onto that word, the English word. I patted my eyes. It was a Thompson submachine gun, not a German MP-38 or MP.D-40 automatic, not a Parabellum or a Mauser. It was a Thompson submachine gun. A sharp order followed, an order given in a language I didn't speak, but which was so familiar. I had heard it in various ports around the world. I had heard it years ago, heard it on shore, heard it on cargo steamers. It roared in my ears during fights in the East End docks of London, whispered seductively in the brothels of Malta, and the gramophone in a Cape Town brothel sang in the same language. And now someone was speaking it here in Bir Hakeim, not far from the front line. Then they put me on my feet and searched me. Why? I don't know. I felt safe at last. The language they spoke was not the language of the firing squad, but of the British.